So still hear people joining, but I think I'll make a start. So just a quick reminder, this session will be recorded. So for the first part of the session, if I could ask you all to please just place yourselves on mute, and we'll let you know when we can unmute ourselves and open out to a discussion. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for attending today in what sounds like good numbers. It's great to have you all here for our event today, which will provide an introduction to asset management decision making. So before we continue, here's an agenda for today's webinar. We'll start with a presentation that will last around 35 minutes. It'll cover the asset management subject of decision making. So this will include an introduction to the subject's individual elements, some key concepts, the associated challenges, as well as some of the approaches for overcoming these challenges. We'll then break out into virtual breakout rooms here on the Teams platform for a networking session for around 20 minutes or so, and then come back together to bring the session to a close. So I think I heard a few people more joining since I started, so welcome to those people. Just to let you know that the session is being recorded, and yeah, please place yourselves on mute for the first part as we try and deliver this webinar via Teams. Thank you again for attending. So as I said, it's great to have you all here. I'm looking forward to meeting as much of you as possible and speaking to you during the networking session of this webinar. So this event is hosted by the Institute of Asset Management, specifically the NxtGen initiative, an initiative that's of growing relevance really as the subject of asset management is of increasing importance in challenges such as the need to achieve net zero economy. And as that's the case, it's continually attracting more and more professionals. So the initiative is driven by the cause of providing new asset management professionals opportunities to learn, share, and network with each other. So as someone who's recently moved to work more directly within the field of asset management over the course of the pandemic, I've seen tremendous value in joining the initiative just to help my own development as an asset management professional. So my name's Yola Hughes and I'm a consultant at Copperleaf, working within the European Customer Experience team based here in the UK. So my move into the world of asset management started when I joined Copperleaf around 8 months or so ago, having previously worked within electricity transmission and as a utility infrastructure consultant since graduating with a degree in electrical engineering. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Copperleaf, Copperleaf is an organisation with a growing global presence in providing asset management decision analytics software, which has allowed asset-intensive organisations to enhance their decision-making processes. Currently, more than $2 trillion worth, I think is the latest figure, worth of infrastructure is being managed globally by Copperleaf Solutions, a figure that's rapidly growing. So as I said, I'm looking forward for the opportunity to speak with you all during the networking session, and if you have any Copperleaf-based questions, can ask them then. As I move through this presentation, it's probably worth asking for you to hold any questions and so on for that networking session, if you don't mind. Great. Okay, so moving into the subject of our discussion today, I think I'd be doing a disservice to those of you who like me, are in the early stages of learning asset management theory if I didn't signpost this document shown on screen. The Institute of Asset Management developed the anatomy to provide an appreciation of asset management for both experts and newcomers. It doesn't provide a detailed explanation of everything, but it does serve as a great overview of the subject, signposting where more detail can be found from other sources. So for that reason, it serves as a great guide for those seeking to achieve some professional recognition via the Institute of Asset Management. I myself am currently working towards completing the IAM certificate, and I found the anatomy to be a great source of information and visuals. that help form like a foundation of knowledge and awareness of the subject, which you can build on. So a free version of the document can be found on the IM website. You can find it fairly quickly after a quick Google. Appreciate the link on the screen doesn't help you too much. So the latest version is number 3, released in 2015. So yeah, please feel free to go and check it out. So as I just mentioned, the anatomy is a great source of visuals that help explain the asset management scope and concepts. An example of a good visual I've taken from the anatomy is this conceptual model of asset management. I like it because it neatly defines the scope of asset management and shows the relationships between the various subject groups, of which the Institute has defined 6. So I think it's a useful graphic to keep in mind. I've found it's helped me solidify what I've read and place individual concept in the context of the wider asset management picture. So the subject of today's webinar is this one here, asset management decision making. So as is presented within the anatomy document, it's the second of 6 asset management subject groups. From the position of this subject on the screen and from the arrows that you can also see moving into this box, you can see that the decision-making concept, or the subject at least, is dependent on information and the details of the asset informations, which is the subject of group 4, and organization and people, which is subject group 5. Following the same logic, you can also see that the decision-making, the subject and the concept is a direct influencer of strategy and planning, that being the subject of group 1. So within the 6 subject groups, the IM has defined 39 individual subjects. You can see that they've been grouped on screen here. 5 of these reside within group 2, today's subject of discussion, the decision-making subject. So as is highlighted here, these subjects are capital investment decision-making, operations and maintenance decision-making, life cycle value realization, resourcing strategy, shutdowns and outage strategy. And we'll try and cover these in a little bit more detail over the course of this presentation. Before doing that, I'd just like to reference one other diagram I've stolen from the anatomy, again, because I've found it to be useful. I think whilst it's been put together to show the key relationships on the strategy of the strategy planning group, which is group 1, and again, not the topic of today's webinar, those boxes highlighted in yellow here, I think it does also capture the interrelationships of the decision-making subjects well too, so those in green. So in the next slides, we will cover each of the subjects of the asset management decision-making group in a little bit more detail, starting with the decision-making subjects, then their relationship with the life cycle value realization subject, before then addressing the relevance of resources, outages, shutdowns, and the associated strategies. The following slides will also include extracts of this diagram you see on screen, because I think it's a useful reference when we cover each of the subjects individually. Okay, so moving into the first of the 5 asset management decision-making subjects, which is capital investment decision-making. This subject includes theory relating to the processes of evaluating and analysing options for creating new assets, increasing the capability of existing assets, or even the replacement of assets at the end of their useful life. Such activities add equity value to an organisation. So what that means is that it increases the organisation's financial worth. For that reason, that the timing and the cost of investments, they can have significant impacts on the organisation's success, ultimately meaning that the associated decision-making processes should be rigorous and justifiable. So it's worth noting at this point, actually, that an organization may have decisions that are mandatory. So they would be those that are required to ensure that the company complies with legal or regulatory conditions. The decision-making process must then allow the organization to justify those other investments that can be considered discretionary, considering multiple factors such as how the organization funds capital investments, the range of alternative investments, opportunities available, and also the investment delivery periods. So as a result, the methods used to evaluate and compare these capital investment options need to consider the value of money over time to assess the impact of the timing or of delaying capital expenditure. Common methods of evaluating such investments fall into the category of cost-benefit analysis, which tend to make use of discounted cash flows to account for the time-varying nature of money. So within such assessments, there's a range of criteria that could be used to compare the investment options with their alternatives. The most common metrics being ones that I've picked out and shown on screen here, which is net present value, internal rate of return, and payback period. So the use of these techniques is a great way of comparing investment options with similar horizons, typically those spanning the short to medium term. However, there is also a need to develop strategies that account for managing investments associated with infrastructure that's deemed to be critical to an organization's success. That could be either due to their financial value of that asset or due to the consequences of those failing. So these strategies must therefore also support the longer term capital forecasts for activities such as the replacement of critical assets. So whilst the financial assessments are vital to review the economic viability of capital investment projects, and they do generally conclude with quantifiable and directly comparable outputs that allow the most economically viable investment option to be identified, I think it is important, especially in our world today, to remember that the hard economics shouldn't be the only influencer in the decision-making process. So less tangible, softer benefits should also influence such processes to ensure organizations fully grasp the value to be derived from an investment option. So that decisions are made with sight of the entire picture and not just a blinkered view. But the question is, what is value? And in reality, what you'll tend to find is in a room such as this one here, full of executive, lawyers, finance managers, engineers, ecologists, customer representatives, you tend to get different answers, as you can see on the screen here. So investments, therefore, are often categorized to align with the delivery of the organization's strategic objectives, which allow an organization to make sure that the investments that best deliver against these objectives are given some level of priority, to make sure that the organization therefore makes effective use of the available funds to deliver organizational objectives and ultimately achieve the strategic plan. Prioritizing discretionary capital expenditure should be done to an agreed criteria, taking into account the value of the decision to the business, as well as the urgency for that requirement. This process is known as value optimization, which aims to deliver the best combination of benefits aligned to the organization's strategic goals. So before continuing to look at the other subjects of the decision-making group, I do want to wander a little bit further down this tangent and delve a little deeper into the concept of value-based decision-making. So advanced use of this concept is made by the Copperleaf Suite, allowing organizations to achieve optimal decision-making within their planning processes via its use. So it achieves this through the use of a value framework, a highly configurable feature that can take input on all things from an organization's strategic objectives to the hourly labor rate of a particular resource. On taking these inputs, the value to be expected from a given portfolio of investments is calculated. A value framework makes use of a common economic scale That's true across all the different measures of value, allowing the associated decisions to be made on a value-based basis between investments with dissimilar value drivers. So in other words, it empowers organizations to make decisions that would deliver the optimum value. Due to the high configurability of the value framework, it's possible to also tweak and update inputs as required to continuously improve the decisions that are made, as well as to make sure that the definitions of value is always aligned with or weighted to appropriately the organization's strategic objectives. I myself, I'm particularly proud of being a part of CopLeaf's effort here, which ultimately has the goal of transforming how the world sees value. I'm a strong believer in the cause, and I do believe that an approach that seeks to optimize value will be critical for achieving a net zero economy. Lists of innovation projects needed to realize the step changes throughout the industry to achieve this goal are growing rapidly, meaning that it's more vital than ever that we facilitate optimal decision-making processes. So that we make sure that as little as possible of these projects are discarded to the nice to have pile and move to the to do pile. So as a quick visual to show how the concept, or to show the value-based decision-making concept in action, I suppose, consider this example of a CopLeaf value framework. So on the left-hand side are some key areas which could easily correspond to an organization's target areas for strategic improvements, against which value is to be measured. So an exercise will have been undertaken by the organization to establish an aligned definition across all of these areas for the measure of value, establishing a common economic scale where the unit of value is equal regardless of the value driver. Now consider 3 investments on this scale. So the first one here, it may be immediately obvious to a business as an investment that they'd want to deliver, even in the case where a value-based approach would, isn't adopted, because you can see that the investment is expected to increase revenue by this amount here, as well as reduce the impact, a benefit here of reducing impact of the customer interruptions by a lesser amount, and that is all considering the spend, the negative value that's shown here, which is the cost of doing that investment, which is relatively small in comparison. So the real power of this framework is when a need comes to compare dissimilar investments, such as the second and also the third investments here, which have value drivers in the areas of productivity, safety risk, environmental risk, and also ones that come at different costs too. So what this allows is the direct comparison of those dissimilar investments on a value-focused basis. So in this example, it allows me to see that whilst the first investment is less expensive than the second is expected to deliver ultimately greater value, shown at the bottom here in this example in terms of net present value. So in the absence of a framework like this, it's very difficult to approach the challenge of value-based decision making. It's easy to see how those investments with softer value drivers could be overlooked. So these could be some of those innovation projects that I mentioned previously that are needed to realize the net zero target that we have. They could be ones that could possibly be overlooked, especially if they're innovative and don't have previous sort of expectations and so on which to measure. Right, okay, back to it. So the second asset management decision-making subject is operations and maintenance decision-making. Maintenance activities here have 2 main goals: to prevent or mitigate the deterioration of performance of in-service assets, as well as to manage the risk of these assets failing. It's good asset management practice to have a maintenance strategy to ensure a predictable and an acceptable level of performance throughout the useful life of an asset. Such strategies would likely involve inspections, testing, monitoring, and preventative maintenance regimes generally. And unlike the decisions made from the evaluation of capital investment options, most decisions don't consider the time value of money, as they tend to be funded from the current year's budget and be recurring in nature, where the frequency of occurrence could be based on either a set time interval, the asset's condition, or the usage levels experienced by that asset. Recommendations are given for maintenance activities, typically by the manufacturer, and these would include the pattern for maintenance occurrence. Though these are typically generic and from the manufacturer, they tend to be for a specific asset type and as I said, quite generic and don't really account for the context of the individual asset's use. So in other words, the recommendations may detail what you could maybe consider as an optimum maintenance strategy for the individual asset, which neglects the environment, usage, the consequence of failure of that particular asset in the context of its role within the wider network. Following such recommendations blindly would lead to an overly risk-averse maintenance approach, an approach that would likely come at a premium, unaffordable or impractical at the scale of many thousands of assets. There are several well-established techniques and methodologies for developing maintenance strategies to address such challenges. We won't be going into the details of these today, but to name a few, there's failure mode and effects analysis, reliability-centered maintenance, and risk-based inspections. In addition to planned routine activities, maintenance strategies must also be considerate of those interventions that are not planned and those that are deemed to be required because of asset failures. For that reason, modelling maintenance for decision making should also involve predictions of future performance. So this involves an assessment of asset risk profiles and anticipated failure patterns, which can be estimated from statistical records of historical usages of such assets, or estimated based on the data sheets from the manufacturers. So whilst conducting such an assessment to establish a maintenance strategy may be feasible at a high level or a small scale via the use of spreadsheets, for large programs of many thousands of assets, say, it's often impractical, and the use of more sophisticated decision support tools, such as the Copperleaf suite, should certainly be considered. So the most sophisticated techniques use complex models for determining optimal intervention frequency, not only for a single asset, but for large fleets of assets. So consider the plot on this slide, another example of something that I've stolen from the anatomy, which is testament to it. So this illustrates the optimization of an asset level decision regarding an interval-based maintenance task to mitigate a failure mode where the risk of failure increases from the time of the maintenance, eventually leading it to failure. So the horizontal axis here, or the axis here, indicates the maintenance frequency in years. So, for example, a 1 would indicate an annual maintenance frequency. 9 would indicate that a maintenance activity would be set for this asset once every 9 years. The vertical axis then indicates the annual cost. So the more frequently the task is carried out, the higher the direct annual cost of that planned maintenance. So as you can see, the blue line, and the lower the risk of failure too, which is the red line. And the opposite is true, the vice versa. So the optimal point of the economic optimal point of a single asset is the point where the total business impact, the sum of both the blue and the red lines, which is shown by the yellow lines, it's the point at which that is at a minimum, at the lowest point. The reality on a larger scale, say when considering the decisions to be taken as a part of forming the maintenance strategy, of an asset base in the thousands, is that optimal approach, the optimal approach will involve cases of suboptimal in maintenance frequencies on an individual asset basis. So what needs to be considered here is the sum or the holistic value across all assets. So it's this exercise here that can often be impractical at an asset portfolio level when using spreadsheets, whilst also considering the many other factors that should be considered, which are not financial in nature. Again, make reference to the value-based approach I mentioned previously. Okay. So the next subject, life cycle value realization, covers the activities done to balance the costs and benefits of different renewal, maintenance, or disposable interventions. So as is shown on the diagram extract at the bottom of this slide, you can see that the activities draw from, but also feed into the previously mentioned decision-making subject areas. They require the optimization of life cycle costs and the value obtained from the asset over the period for which the organization is responsible for managing them. So this can be achieved by using a combination of techniques that fall into two main categories. The first being life cycle costing. So this is the analysis of cost implications for an asset or a system of assets over the organization's period of responsibility. The second is one that I've touched on before, value optimization, which is in addition to life cycle costs and that technique, it also considers the value of the asset system. So in other words, these techniques aim to establish the best value for money. The two technique types combine capital investment decision-making with operations and maintenance decision-making processes to account for costs, risks, value, and opportunities to support asset management decisions and the formation of the respective strategies. So there are several techniques and methodologies that fall into these categories. The appropriate combination of these should be selected to match the contextual needs. So, for example, a highly critical or complex situation with many considerations would likely not be best served by a simple cash flow or payback analyses, because these may tend to bias the shorter term solutions or those or even be unable to evaluate options with vastly differing sort of horizons. So in order to account and compare for the longer term value derived by major investments, more advanced assessments should be undertaken to normalize the end value delivered in all cases to allow good comparison. So further details on the application of these techniques and the benefits that can be realized from them are contained in the Institute of Asset Management's subject-specific guidance documents, SSGs. There's one specifically made for this particular subject, life cycle value realization. I'd like to point out at this stage that there is work being undertaken currently by the Institute of Asset Management to create subject-specific guidance documents that covers each of the 39 asset management subjects. So whilst many of these documents are already complete, some do remain as works in progress. The status of this effort you can check on the IAM's website on the SSG section of all places. There is opportunities to contribute to these available too. Should you wish to get involved, reach out to the Institute. Great. Okay. So something that's shaped by, but which also influences the decision-making processes is the availability of the required resource and the associated planning strategies. As such, resource strategy is the fourth subject group on the decision-making subject group. The goal of the resource strategy is to capture the best approach for establishing or procuring the resource required to deliver asset management plans for the relevant planning horizons. Examples of the resources that you could consider would be labour, skills, competencies, inventories, spares, plant equipment, specialist tools, the list goes on really. that the appropriate mix of these internal and external resources can be influenced or constrained by many external factors, such as supply chain capacity, as well as working practices and political or even labour union considerations. So as a result, and to minimize the impact of resource availability fluctuations within external markets on the organization's normal operations, businesses typically take the approach of identifying those capabilities that form the backbone of their general activities, the core activities, and try to bring those in-house. Other activities not considered as the organization's core functions may be more effectively resourced by outsourcing or purchasing external capability. The decision regarding what the appropriate mix of internal or external resource should look like for a given period will depend on existing internal resource capacity, capability, external market availability, as well as the type of the activities that need to be resourced. So, for example, the infrequent nature of an intervention requiring specialist capabilities may justify the hiring of a specialist contractor to conduct the work for that particular time. However, should the risk level associated with that asset's failure be substantial enough, the organization may consider it to be more appropriate to bring in that specialist capability in-house. So one other thing I wanted to point out on this slide is something that's not shown within the diagram extract at the bottom, is the relationship between resourcing strategies and other organizational strategies, such as human resource strategy and the general procurement strategy. Organizations should really consider the value of being well informed on all of these relationships and all the factors that may influence or be influenced by resource. Failure to do this could result in inefficiencies within the decision-making processes, planning strategies, and the delivery of asset management activities, which in turn could increase the organization's exposure to risk to unacceptable levels. So the last of the 5 decision-making subjects is shutdowns and outage strategy. So first, let's take a look at the definitions of what each of these words mean. A shutdown involves fully shutting down an asset system, a production process, or a service to a customer completely. An outage, on the other hand, involves taking only a part of an asset system or process. Typically, these would have some level of redundancy built into them. So taking them out of service. So whilst an appreciation of the conceptual difference between these two will aid the detailed understanding of the specific corresponding areas of this subject, the anatomy does make interchangeable use of these terms because both involve the action of taking assets out of service. So it's probably just worth noting that. So whilst both of these types of activities would be are typically required, they are, well, it should be appreciated that they are both expensive and can impact output service levels. They also often require skilled and scarce labour to be set to work at the same time, hence the influence on the resourcing strategy indicated in the extract of that conceptual diagram on screen. A shutdowns and outage strategy explores the options available to complete the work activities efficiently and safely within the available outage windows. Ultimately, there are a number of factors that can influence such an evaluation, such as the type of assets being maintained, the environment, and the contextual importance. That list really goes on. The application of optimal O&M decision-making identifies the optimum intervals to execute maintenance tasks and time windows within which aging assets should be replaced. This is used to create work schedules and scopes, which then need to be coordinated with an optimal shutdown and outage strategy. So this is why the subjects have been given that sort of interdependencies on the screen here. So During the complex coordination exercise, or this complex coordination exercise, it is normal for some activities to be moved from their individual optimal timing to fit within the available shutdown or outage windows in order to achieve the lowest total business impact for the overall maintenance program. So due to the number of considerations here and the influencing factors, such assessments require specialized applications for decision making. The Copperleaf Suite's asset focus product is capable of such an assessment and even includes a feature named rules-based grouping, which, as the name sort of suggests, intelligently and optimally groups asset interventions to outages based on a set of specific rules. So to determine the behavior of this feature, let's consider this conceptual example. So here there are two interventions to consider, A and B. The time at which the optimum value can be realized from undertaking these interventions can be seen to be at different times. So you can see this A example here is in 2022 at the peak of its curve, and B at the peak of its curve in 2025. However, on sort of undertaking an assessment to compare the costs saved by having a single outage window as opposed to two here, relative also to the value lost by undertaking the interventions at a suboptimal level. Just progress this animation here. You can see in the example that there is a net gain to be realized by grouping these interventions together into a single outage window. So the cost savings here, the loss value because of them being undertaken simultaneously but at suboptimal time, and then the net gain is shown here. So this exercise in practice on a fleet of many thousands or even hundreds of thousands of assets is complex. But this simplistic example does demonstrate the power of considering the holistic value of work programs as opposed to the individual asset. Okay, so that concludes the presentation part of the webinar, really, and our introduction to the asset management decision-making subject group. I hope you've all found it useful, even as as an overview at this stage. As I said previously, more specific subject guides are available on the IAM's website. So for the 5 subjects that we've covered today, there are 2 subject specific guidance documents available, one covering both capital investment decision making and operations and maintenance decision making, as well as a separate one which I referenced previously that covers the life cycle and value realization subject. Documents for the other 2 subjects in this group are coming soon. That they're currently in the progress of being developed. So I'm sure your eyes have seen them. There is a cost to having access to these documents. They do come at a charge, but IAM members are offered these at half price. And I think I'm right in saying that being joining as a free member would also make you eligible for these discounts. Possibly need to check that. And then before the networking session, just one other thing to signpost here. There are other documents that the Institute of Asset Management is currently in the process of re-releasing. They are key guidance documents, and they're ones that are also sponsored by Copperleaf. These are implementing and improving a management system for asset management and developing a maintenance and strategic asset management plan. So the former provides an insight on the management systems for asset management as a quite disciplined approach. The latter provides almost stuck to time. So I'll now pass over to Binal and my colleague Binal and see if we can break out into the individual breakout sessions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Yellow. What I'll do now is I will just break everyone out into rooms of 4 or 5. If you can introduce yourselves, tell each other how long you've been in asset management, and yeah, just discuss the great webinar Yellow's just given. So it won't be long now, just creating the rooms.
This is a first for me. I'm excited.
And there we go. Please do feel free to add those you're connecting with on LinkedIn and continue these discussions. And if you'd like more networking sessions via NxtGen, please do email NxtGen or the IM. We can definitely set these up. What I'm going to do now is just create another set of close the session.
Yeah, so we'll close the session here. I'm going to just quickly share one more slide, just because there's just some signposts to. Oh, I've gone from the beginning. Bear with me. Yeah, so there's just covering, I think, what Binal's already said. Thank you all for attending and taking an hour out of your busy schedules. There's more information on the IAM website, and there's a specific section for the NxtGen initiative. Should you also be interested, feel free to reach out to myself. My email address is there. Similarly, my colleague Binal, I'm sure she won't mind if you start dropping her a few messages too. And then above all that, if there is IAM specific information that you need, then please feel free to reach out to the NxtGen email address that's also on screen there. So yeah, thank you all for attending, and I hope you found value in attending.